In the army, we have a saying: the standard you walk past is the standard you accept. And while on this channel we do talk about a few chaotic and problematic people, from the Amber Heards to the Elizabeth Holmes and of course Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, I noticed that the main focus, rightfully so, is on these people's actions. But rarely do we stop to consider those around them who, willfully or not, allowed these actions to take place when they may have had the power to stop them. As someone who has witnessed firsthand the devastating effects that enabling perpetrators can have on innocent lives, it's been part of this channel's mission to shine a light on the effects of silence or complacency or even being complicit. And I wanted to bring to the forefront the importance of saying no to those people who routinely test the limits, if not absolutely overstep them. Amber Heard saw no real consequences to her abuse of Johnny Depp until it escalated to grievous bodily harm. Elizabeth Holmes, constantly enabled by her family in her youth and then later by powerful older men who simply stood by at best as she perpetrated her fraud, and at worst denied any wrongdoing on her part, even when the evidence was right there in front of their faces. In Meghan Markle's case, the general consensus is her father spoiled her rotten, and this is the result. And based on what I've heard about Prince Harry and how he was spoiled rotten by his late mother, we can say the same about him too. But that's not where the problem starts or ends. It's not always going to be a doting parent that results in a terrible human being. Because sometimes there are other people who surround you in life who, for whatever reason, decided not to step in and stop certain things, bad things, from happening. And thanks to Valentine Lowe's book, Courtiers, which I made quite an in-depth video about this time last year called The Reject, if you haven't seen it already, we know that the palace staff, by their very admission, so this is not me casting blame, they've admitted to being complacent and allowing Meghan and Harry to overstep the boundaries time and time again by bending over backwards to make them happy, thereby feeding, albeit inadvertently, the insatiable sense of entitlement of the monster. The very interesting thing about the palace's relationship with Meghan Markle is how very early on she seemed to have a grasp on them. I'm talking as far back as 2016, when that scathing first unprecedented statement was released by Jason Kanoff on behalf of Prince Harry to chastise and attack, really, the media and the public for their supposedly racist and sexist coverage of Meghan Markle. We've already talked about this 1,000 times by now. There was no such coverage. Of course, some people on social media were nasty. People on social media are nasty every day to everyone. I mean, look what they're doing to the Princess of Wales even after she announced her cancer diagnosis. Meghan Markle is not special in that way, and the Princess of Wales didn't have any statements released on her behalf, even in the decade pretty much that she was dating William and was being hounded. Because that's just not how the palace does things. Jason Kanoff actually admitted that while it wasn't usual palace practice, he'd do it simply because Harry wanted him to. After an ultimatum that Meghan had given Harry, telling him that she'd basically break up with him if that statement wasn't announced, Jason Kanoff did Harry's bidding and released it. Much to the chagrin of the royal family, the other offices, Clarence House and Buckingham Palace, and the press itself. That statement certainly did not endear Jason Kanoff's reputation with the press, and it was pretty much going downhill from that point. The problem is, the palace staff, according to Courtiers, actually saw through Meghan's intentions. They knew that what she wanted was public validation of her relationship with Prince Harry. Never mind the fact that they were only dating for a few months at that point, and she was still just a girlfriend. The palace went along with something that was vastly exaggerated at best and an outright lie at worst. And so the effect that this had was showing Meghan Markle from the very beginning that they were willing to do whatever it took, no matter how unprecedented, no matter how drastic and uncalled for, to make her happy. But even that, as we saw when we discussed courtiers last year, and as we will see today, wasn't enough for the likes of Meghan. Strike two comes shortly after the engagement was announced in late November 2017. At that time, the topic of security came up. Meghan was very concerned. We all know from her Netflix mockumentary series how she exaggerated how she was being stalked in Canada. I mean, even the head of police came out after the documentary and said, I don't know what she's talking about. There was nothing happening at the time, and we responded anytime she called us. But we know how obsessed Meghan is with privilege and status, and of course with that comes taxpayer-funded security, even though we all know she wasn't a royal at the time. Now, Harry's private secretary at the time, Elaine Fox, spent a considerable amount of time talking to other private secretaries and working with government agencies, aka ROVEC, to really push this issue of giving Meghan security. Because there was resistance. At the time, the monarchy was already being slimmed down and blood royals weren't being protected, so why should Meghan be? But for whatever reason, and I quote, Ed had to wage a huge battle to get them to understand that she, Meghan, would not be able to live her life without police protection. That sounds like a very dramatic statement, which means, of course, it came straight from Meghan's mouth. It took 2 months to secure this arrangement for Meghan, but even then, she wasn't happy. In fact, she and Harry were convinced that the palace were deliberately stalling when nothing could be further from the truth. But in Harry and Meghan's view, it simply wasn't good enough. And we will see this pattern repeat itself time and time again. Now, why I've chosen this as an example of more enabling is because the woman simply wasn't entitled to security. I'm not sure if it's standard practice, but based on the battle, the uphill battle that Elaine Fox had to wage with ROVEC, I'm guessing it wasn't. And yet, what Meghan wanted, Meghan got, thereby reaffirming the notion that she is so special and important enough to control the palace staff and have them do her bidding like a ring around her finger. Now this one's a big one, the bullying. It turns out that both Meghan and Harry's appalling behavior to their staff started long before their marriage. As an example, in late 2017, after the engagement was announced, a senior aide had discreetly raised the topic of how Meghan and Harry were treating their staff poorly. Examples were expecting them to respond to 5 a.m. emails or harassing them and hounding them on a Friday night. And that was when Meghan infamously was said to say, it's not my job to coddle people. But even before the wedding, the staff around them felt very strained and effectively bullied. In fact, one member of staff around this time had already confided to a colleague that they were thinking of resigning because Meghan and Harry were, I quote, outrageous bullies. Now, in the rundown to the wedding, we all know of Tiara Gate, the egg tasting incident, and various other examples. Little Charlotte, when she was only 3 years old, various instances where Meghan's monster was out in full display. And all Harry did was shout at people and tell them what Meghan wants, Meghan gets. And yet, the staff didn't do anything about it. Now, to be fair to Queen Elizabeth, Prince William, and the Princess of Wales, they did intervene in their own way. We know the Queen shut down Harry when he said what Meghan wants, Meghan gets to Angela Kelly. We know the Queen told Meghan, you don't talk to my staff like this, when she tasted egg, or she thought she tasted egg in a vegan dish. And we know Princess Catherine confronted her about how she's been treating her daughter. And of course, Prince William, let's not forget Prince William with the whole fight that Harry wrote about in his book. That was essentially about Meghan Markle's behavior. So aside from these instances, the only thing I can think of, and I'm still not convinced because Meghan was nasty from the very beginning, from 2016, but the only concession available is that this was the lead up to a wedding. Meghan was going through a bridezilla phase, which, if you ask me, no one is entitled to be nasty to anyone. Least of all, in such a joyous occasion. It's not like you're going through something terminal. You're meant to be happy. Yes, it's stressful to plan things. A big deal. Deal with it. Don't take it out on people around you. But best case scenario, that's what they thought. Of course, we all know that that was far from the case, because if anything, Meghan's atrocious behavior only escalated exponentially after the wedding. And yet, the higher-ups in the hierarchy didn't do anything to stop it. We know that staff complained incessantly, to the point that Jason Kanoff, while Meghan and Harry were in Australia in 2018, took it upon himself to escalate the issue and formally lodge a complaint of sorts. But the person in charge, who later denied ever receiving such a letter, at least according to the book, didn't do anything about it. It was swept under the rug. And as far as I'm aware, Meghan and Harry weren't even given a slap on the wrist. And so it continued. And that's why we saw news, headline after headline, about the ever-revolving staff door of Meghan and Harry's offices. They just couldn't keep staff for long enough. And that's also why Meghan and Harry and William and Catherine's offices split. At that point, it seems Catherine and William had effectively washed their hands off Meghan and Harry, and they wanted to protect their staff by separating them. Speaking of splitting offices, Meghan and Harry wanted to set up at Windsor Castle so that they would be close to Frogmore. And guess what? The palace staff were actually amenable to doing that for them until the Queen, the late Queen, and Prince William stepped in and said no. They set up in Buckingham Palace. We have plenty of space for them there. Otherwise, too bad. The problem here arises when you consider the fact that this behavior was detected a very long time ago, as far back as 2016. And I firmly believe that Meghan, had she been put in her place very early on, had these problems been nipped in the bud, and she was shown by the palace staff that this is unacceptable, it is very likely that the Sussex Survivor Club wouldn't even exist. People wouldn't have been traumatized. They wouldn't have been slumped over their desks crying. Meghan would have been shown that there are consequences to her actions in some way or another. I mean, complain to the Queen. Maybe have the Queen tell her, if this is how you're going to behave, then there really is no place for you in this family. You're not a good fit. Anything. But instead, she was given the green light because, complacency is complicity. Isn't that the saying? Isn't that something Meghan says, actually, ironically? Now, that's not to say that absolutely nothing happened, because we all know how there was an investigation, which was sparked by Valentine Lowe's story in the lead up to the Oprah interview of Meghan Markle's alleged bullying. But that was done in 2021, which was years after Meghan joined the family. And something was only done when it was officially put out in the public domain by Valentine Lowe. And I don't know about you, but that just doesn't sit well with me. Doesn't the palace value their staff enough to have done something serious about it before it was made public? It just looks like a cleanup attempt rather than an earnest intention to look after their staff, protect them, and if possible, reprimand the perpetrator in an appropriate manner. But instead we get news that the report's results will not be released. Now, to me, that screams Meghan Markle probably did everything she was alleged to have done. Because if she was in the clear, then it wouldn't have been difficult to announce that. So I think the fact that it was suppressed speaks volumes, as does the fact that she hasn't sued till this very day. For a wedding gift, Meghan was given diamond chandelier earrings from the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. Now, we all know about Mohammed bin Salman and his connection to the brutal murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Now, given that Jamal Khashoggi was murdered on the 2nd of October of 2018, of course, there was nothing wrong with accepting that gift at the time of the wedding, which was held in May of 2018. But a problem arises when you consider the fact that Meghan wore these diamonds when she attended a state dinner on the 23rd of October 2018 in Fiji that was held in their honor by the president. 3 entire weeks since the death of Jamal Khashoggi. Now, the earrings caused a stir. And rather than stopping her from wearing them, Kensington Palace enabled her by covering for her and telling the press, whether they lied or whether she misled them, I don't know, but they told the press that they were on loan from an undisclosed source. Later in court years, you find out that Samantha Cohen, who I believe was their private secretary at the time, was told by Meghan that they were from Chopard, which of course we know is a lie. Now, Meghan denies ever saying that, but we all know how low she scores in the credibility score. And we see the consequences of this enabling behavior when Meghan, not 3 weeks later, wears the same diamonds to the king's, or at the time, Prince Charles's 70th birthday celebrations in London. Now, Meghan wants us to believe that she had no idea of the killing. Never mind that she claims to be a highly intelligent, switched-on woman who reads publications like The Economist. The Economist, who between the killing and the king's birthday, released at least 2 articles talking about the killing and Mohammed bin Salman's connection to it. And if you're doubting that the staff enabled Meghan and you think I'm being too harsh on them, get this. There were staff at Kensington Palace whose job was to register every single gift that was given to a member of the royal family. And they knew exactly what these earrings were and who they came from. And yet they decided, this is what they're telling Valentine Lowe in his book, they deliberately decided not to confront Meghan Markle about it. A source said, "We made a decision not to confront Meghan and Harry on it out of fear for what the reaction would be." And if that isn't a classic case of enabling, then I don't know what is. Apparently, though, after Meghan wore the earrings the second time for King Charles's birthday, an aide had apparently decided to take it up with Prince Harry, not Meghan, because presumably she's too scary. Now, the interesting thing is that Harry was described to have been shocked, not because of news of the revelation of such a horrific connection, no, but shocked that people knew where the earrings came from. Although, according to the Sussex's lawyers, they deny having any knowledge or even having any conversation brought up about the earrings. But I leave it to you. Who do you believe? Finally, we have Megxit. We all know about Meghan and Harry's Megxit demands, basically half in, half out. We do whatever we please, whenever we please. If you watched my video, The Reject, last year, you'll remember me saying that the staff, upon looking into Meghan and Harry's demands, actually worked around the clock for 5 days straight, trying to make every single demand happen. It wasn't until the late Queen stepped in and said, absolutely not. You're either in or out. You choose. I'll give you 12 months because I love you, but otherwise, it's goodbye. Some people actually think the Queen was still too soft with them at the time, and they believe that they should have been given much stricter conditions for keeping their titles, for instance. So maybe signing an agreement with them, a binding contract, or even an NDA, where you can't use the titles. You can't go about defaming us and talking about us on national television, lest you lose your titles and all your privileges. However, on the topic of titles, if you've seen my video, The Untitled, it's quite recent, you would know that it's a big headache and it's never been done before, barring the brief period of World War I, when really there were foreign princes who also had British titles that were eventually taken away for bearing arms against England. So it's quite a very specific situation that didn't really serve as precedent. It's just too niche. But otherwise, you go through history and you see royals who were accused of treason, who were beheaded in the Tower, and they still didn't lose their titles. So if you're ever curious about why that hasn't happened yet, just watch my video, The Untitled, and maybe you'll get a clue as to why. So considering all of this, to me, again, as someone who has witnessed criminals, really criminals, being enabled, maybe because of their gender, maybe because they're friends with certain people. You know, people have their reasons for enabling. And sometimes they do it innocently, like doting parents. Sometimes it's a lot more sinister. The palace staff, I don't think anyone had any bad intentions. I think they were genuinely, initially determined to make her happy, and later too scared to do anything about it, which effectively confirms the bullying allegations, even though they're still alleged at this point. The sad thing is, all of the coddling was for nothing, because as one former staffer put it, we were having to prove that the institution would bend over backwards to make her happy. That wasn't what she wanted. She wanted to be rejected because she was obsessed with that narrative from day one. So all the signs were there. The courtiers knew it very early on, but for the reasons I just disclosed, they just chose to ignore them. And while I of course understand that Meghan and Harry are both autonomous adults who are entirely responsible for their own actions, we don't live in a vacuum as individuals. That's why laws exist, and that's why certain authorities exist to enforce these laws. We can't just say every man for himself. Society would collapse. By not being put in their place early enough, and by showing Meghan that she can pretty much get away with anything she does, no matter how heinous, they've helped engorge, enlarge the monster that, yes, already existed within her, but could have been curbed, could have been diminished had she been put in her place. Because I believe that everyone can be put in their place. There is no one beyond reproach. It's just a matter of whether the individuals who are in a position to do that are willing to do that. And we are seeing way too many instances of people who just won't. Or perhaps they think they can't. They genuinely think they can't, and so they don't. And the consequences, as we know, are still playing out. We've got most recently Endgame, accusing Catherine and King Charles of racism, and now we've got these bots who reports say are Chinese and Russian bots and Iranian bots to destabilize the monarchy. I don't know. Considering the nature of the attacks that have been pretty much solely directed at Prince William and the Princess of Wales, I don't see how that's the case, and I don't see how there isn't a connection to California. I'm not saying that I have proof, and I know this for a fact, but given that William and Catherine have been declared as arch nemeses of Meghan and Harry, it's a bit of a coincidence. I suppose the question is, when will this end? What Princess Catherine has been going through these past few months, and even now, even after her diagnosis, is beyond horrendous. And if Meghan and Harry aren't involved and aren't allowing their Sussex squad to do all this, then why not speak up and stop them? We're talking about enablers. Maybe Meghan and Harry are enabling their followers. For people who talk about humanity and setting a good example, how do you explain this? It's not a coincidence that the bots are also pro-Meghan bots. They're not just independent, random accounts that have no affiliations. They love Meghan and Harry. Well, Meghan and Harry, how about you do something about it? Because if you don't, the standard you walk past is the standard you accept. And that's it. That's all I have for you. See you next time.